Welcome back. A tale of inheritance, silence and rot, drawn from the margins of forgotten archives. Tonight we descend into a history best left sealed, but the records persist, and so must the telling. Before we continue, like, subscribe and share. The year was 1798, though the pages that preserve this truth have been gnawed at by mice, water-stained and half-obscured by the censor's pen. The incident, when spoken of at all, was remembered in whispers along the Kentucky Wilderness Trail, that treacherous artery by which whole families pressed westward, lured by promises of rich soil and liberty. But beneath the surface of that promise lay a darker inheritance, a hidden commerce of flesh and blood. Among the names redacted in the Lexington Territorial Court Journals, Volume 2, sealed copy 1800, one appears again and again: Mercy Harrow. She was but 13 years old, orphaned, and as the brittle church register notes with clinical indifference, with child. The margins of that page carry a later hand, perhaps a clergyman or archivist, who has scrawled in fading ink. Her condition made her both vulnerable and useful. Useful to whom? That question alone explains why so many records of her short life survive not in public libraries but in restricted folios, stamped property of the territorial authorities, access denied. The wilderness roads of the late 18th century were not empty. They were peopled by caravans, settlers, and those who made their living from the desperation of others. Enter the figure most often identified in these suppressed accounts, Elias Daniels. Publicly, he styled himself a guide, licensed in form, if not in spirit. In reality, Daniels operated a labyrinth of exploitation, escorting families westward, murdering them in isolated passes, and selling their belongings through a network of corrupt merchants from Richmond to New Orleans. But his greatest cruelty lay not in the murders themselves. Daniels had an uncanny eye for weakness, for spotting those whose dependency could be bent into silence. Mercy, small for her age and swollen with pregnancy, became the centerpiece of his design. The earliest surviving mention of her role comes from the deposition of Sarah Carver, one of the intended victims. The girl carried the burden of one older than her years. She would sit by the fire and whisper warnings none of us dared heed aloud. Her knowledge of the caves, the signals, the hidden paths, she had learned them at his side, but turned them at last against him. That single fragment found in a water-damaged folder labeled Exhibit B, Harrow Proceedings, reveals more than it intended. It suggests that Mercy had once been trusted by Daniels himself, inducted into his methods, perhaps forced to play accomplice before she broke from him. We must pause here to consider the atmosphere in which her story unfolded. The frontier was as much a psychological landscape as a geographic one. Fear was currency, hunger, weather, and isolation ground down moral resistance. In this setting, secrecy became a weapon more potent than any blade. A surviving letter from the Pritchard family Bible, dated March 1798, warns, "The man who calls himself our guide walks too softly for an honest soul. He asks the children too many questions. Mercy tells us to feign ignorance when he inquires where our kin lie buried." It is precisely these marginal, half-hidden documents, letters, registers, coded inventories that form the skeleton of Mercy's tale. No single account gives the whole. Each is a fragment, stained with dread. The deeper horror is that her pregnancy itself appears to have been the instrument of Daniel's control. One obstetrical notebook, seized from his camp after his eventual arrest, lists with chilling precision: gestational age, 6 months, walking pace limited, vulnerable to fatigue, emotional susceptibility heightened by isolation. The entry is unsigned but written in Daniel's unmistakable hand. Scholars debate whether he recorded these details out of sadistic amusement or as part of a more systematic study. Either way, it demonstrates the medicalization of cruelty, a young girl's body catalogued as if she were nothing more than a specimen. In the months leading up to the fateful events, Daniels refined his performance. He wore the mask of protector to families who did not know that other families had vanished before them. Mercy, bound to him by circumstance, was perceived as a helper, a silent ward. Only gradually did her true role emerge. According to John Carver's testimony, cross-examined June 1799, now sealed, she began leaving coded warnings, stacked stones along the roadside, scraps of fabric tied to branches, symbols only a desperate eye would read. Some families ignored them, others thought them superstitions of a frightened child, But for the carvers, those warnings were the difference between survival and obliteration. Thus, part 1 must end where the real horror begins, not in bloodshed, but in silence. A girl scarcely more than a child, thrust into the role of reluctant accomplice to a man who embodied the frontier's most parasitic instincts, a community of families walking blind into the wilderness, and a system of archives and authorities that preferred suppression to disclosure, redaction to remembrance. What remains to us are the shards, a registry, a deposition, a Bible page stained with wax. But from these fragments, the outline of a greater darkness is unmistakable. Mercy Harrow was no ordinary child. She was both pawn and resistance, her body weaponized by one who would use her vulnerability as shield, yet whose empire she would one day undo. The stage is set, the wilderness waits, the cave where her name would be carved in stone lies ahead. The documents grow fainter here, but the mood they convey is unmistakable, unease thickening among the traveling parties, as though the land itself conspired with Elias Daniels to magnify dread. By the spring of 1798, 3 caravans had already vanished in the thickets north of the Wilderness Road, near the limestone ridges later known as the Harrow Caves. Their absence was recorded only in afterthought, delayed, presumed lost to weather or Indian attack. But between the lines in the private journals of settlers, a more sinister explanation gathers shape. One such entry, from the diary of Ruth Harmon, is among the few surviving pieces not yet redacted. April 12. The girl Mercy came to me as we stopped for the evening. Her eyes were wide, her hands shaking, but her voice carried strange resolve. She told me not to drink from the kettle if Elias served it first. She dared not say why. The others dismissed her, but I could not. She is with child. Why would such a one invent terror for no cause? The Harmons did not survive. Their wagon was discovered years later in a ravine, splintered, bones scattered, no sign of Mercy in their company. It was through the Pritchard family, however, that whispers became warning. Their son, barely 10 years old, recalled Mercy scratching marks into a length of birch bark, concentric circles with a slash through the center. His father kept it, suspecting it meant something urgent. That birch scrap, water-stained and folded into a church register, still exists in the archive of St. Matthew's Parish, catalogued under the cryptic note, "Gift from a child, interpretation unknown." To the carvers who traveled near both families, the meaning was unmistakable. The circles resembled the pits Daniels used to conceal bodies before stripping wagons of goods. Mercy, bound by fear yet desperate to reveal, had devised a code simple enough for a child to convey yet obscure enough to escape Daniels' suspicion. We must pause to examine the dual existence of Elias Daniels. To the law he was a guide of repute, licensed and vouched for by men of standing. His signature appears in ledgers, his fees neatly recorded, his service commended. Yet in the hidden corridors of his trade, he embodied what frontier sermons called the wolf in shepherd's guise. The families saw only his calculated patience, offering food, setting snares, telling stories by the fire. To the carvers, however, an unease persisted. Sarah Carver later testified that his gaze lingered too long on the children, as though measuring them, and that his hands, supposedly roughened from travel, were suspiciously smooth, more suited to ink and blade than soil. Mercy bore the contradiction within. By day she tended fires, carried water, whispered instructions in tones so faint they seemed hallucinated. By night she withdrew into herself, hand pressed against the swell of her belly as if protecting the life inside from the predator. With a deposition from John Carver, preserved in poor condition, recounts, "She told me, plain as I speak it now, that he, Daniels, kept ledgers of our names. She had seen the book in his pack, lists of families gone before us, each with marks beside their entry. She would not touch it, nor let me, but said it was proof enough that he had dark design. That ledger has never surfaced, though references to it appear in at least 4 separate testimonies. Whether it was destroyed or locked away in territorial archives remains unknown. The true horror of these months lies not in overt violence, but in the erosion of trust. Families debated in hushed tones whether the child's warnings were delusions. Some pitied her condition, assuming her grief and impending motherhood had unmoored her mind. Others argued she was attempting to sow discord, perhaps under Daniels' coercion. Yet patterns emerged. A cup of broth that sickened all but Daniels, a missing infant's shoe later found near the guide's sleeping roll, wagons delayed at crossings where ambush seemed inevitable. Always Mercy, watching, trembling, signaling in ways half believed. Artifacts survive that testify to this climate of suspicion. One is an iron caliper, rusted, discovered in a cave near the old trail. Scholars note its design matches late 18th century obstetrical instruments, wholly unsuited to the wilderness. Its presence there suggests Daniels carried tools not merely for survival, but for the cold cataloguing of body. Another is an age of anatomical sketches, pelvic bones rendered with clinical precision, margins filled with cryptic tallies. The page bears the initials ED, in a practiced hand. Why should a frontier guide carry such instruments? The question haunts every analyst. Was Daniels not merely murderer, but collector of knowledge? The kind of knowledge drawn from suffering, disguised as science. As the caravans pressed deeper westward, tension reached breaking point. In the Harmon camp, an infant sickened after eating meat, offered by Dan. In the Pritchard camp, a wagon wheel snapped under suspicious circumstances, leaving them stranded at dusk. Each misfortune, Mercy insisted, was orchestrated. Her warnings grew more frantic, more insistent. Sarah Carver recalled her voice on a storm-laden night. He will not stop until we are all his tally marks. You must run when I give the sign. Do not look back. The testimony ends abruptly there, the ink blurred. But from later accounts, we know that night marked the pivot, when suspicion transformed into certainty, when Mercy resolved not merely to warn but to intervene. Thus, Part 2 closes upon the brink of revelation. Families walk still beside the man they half suspect, unwilling or unable to confront him. A girl, frail yet resolute, encodes salvation in symbols, risking the wrath of the one who holds her captive. The wilderness closes around them, silence broken only by the scratching of quills, the murmur of fire, and the relentless counting of names, in a ledger now lost to us. The cave lies ahead. The moment of confrontation waits. The ledgers are gone, or rather hidden in a place beyond reach. What remains are fragments, depositions, letters, faint echoes preserved in parish margins, but through them we glimpse what the travelers began to understand in the late summer of 1798, that Elias Daniels' kindly mask was thinning, and the abyss behind it was beginning to The story turns upon Mercy, her endurance, and her secret acts. She was no longer content to whisper warnings. Instead, she sought to document the pattern, to leave traces the families could not ignore. The most compelling account comes from Sarah Carver, who survived to give testimony before the county tribunal in 8. She spoke of waking in the gray of dawn to find Mercy hunched over a square of birch bark, her breath short, her eyes bloodshot. By the dim flame she sketched circles and lines, notations in a script of her own making. She said to me, "If he takes us, these marks will speak after I am gone. Do not let them burn with the firewood. Hide them where the men cannot see." I asked what they meant. She said only, "It is the count of graves." Those markings, water-stained and folded into the back of St. Matthew's parish register, remain today. Conservators note the ink was mixed with something darker than soot, perhaps blood. The ledger Daniels himself kept has never been recovered, yet 4 witnesses across separate testimonies described glimpsing it. A calfskin volume, pages ruled with neat columns, each headed with a family name, alongside symbols: a cross for children, a circle for women, a slash for men. In some entries, entire families were crossed through, as though extinguished. One deposition, now partially redacted, claims that Daniels referred to the book as his anatomical account. What he meant by this, whether mere catalogue or record of experiments, is left to speculation. At the same time, evidence suggests Daniels carried instruments, unfit for a guide's trade. In 1821, spelunkers discovered in a cavern near the Kentucky Ridge a small iron box, rusted. Inside were fragments of surgical steel, forceps, bone saw, and an ether vial marked "Apothecary of Williamsburg." The tools bore acid scoring as though hastily cleaned with lye. Contemporary scholars of medical history have noted that such implements were designed for obstetrical practice, the extraction of children from the womb, the measurement of pelvis and skull. That Daniels bore them on the frontier trail implies an intention wholly incompatible with guiding wagons. The families, meanwhile, debated in whispers. Was Mercy deranged by her captivity, her mind fractured by grief and the burden of her pregnancy, or had she indeed glimpsed what Daniels kept hidden? Thomas Pritchard, who did not survive, was recorded by his brother as saying, "The girl is cracked, no doubt, but better to heed a cracked bell than none at all. I'd sooner march by moonlight than drink one more of his draught." The Pritchards began keeping their own fire, refusing Daniels' food. Soon after, their wagon fell behind, only to vanish from the trail entirely. All that remained were the wheel ruts, leading into the underbrush,
ending in churned soil beside a limestone sinkhole. Mercy's pregnancy added another layer of dread. Sarah Carver testified that Mercy often spoke in murmurs to the unborn child, telling it to wait, to be still a little longer. Carver interpreted this as a desperate plea, that birth not come under Daniel's shadow.
There is one disturbing note from Reverend Alford's journal, later seized as evidence. He wrote, "The Daniels woman bore herself with a peculiar protectiveness, never letting the guide's hand come near her womb. I could not help but suspect his designs were not paternal, but surgical. In her glance was terror, as if she knew herself destined for the table, the knife, the caliper. By late autumn, the unease could no longer be contained. The Carvers secretly gathered the surviving families, weighing escape against confrontation. But Daniels had anticipated dissent. He divided the groups under pretense of lightening the trail, urging some wagons north and others south. Each division left families isolated, more vulnerable. It was then Mercy resolved to act. A fragmentary deposition from John Carver records, "She came to me at dusk, saying she would draw his gaze and that I must be ready. She pressed into my hand a strip of bark, on which she had carved a single word, 'Run.' I asked when. She answered, 'When he bleed.' The words chill even now, for the girl understood she could not survive, but she could provoke a wound that might give others their chance. The event itself remains clouded. Some accounts describe Mercy luring Daniels toward the ravine under pretense of gathering water. Others suggest she feigned labor, drawing him into a cave where she struck him with a stone. However it transpired, the record is clear. Elias Daniels returned to camp that night with a bandaged hand, blood seeping through cloth. He claimed injury by misstep, yet in Mercy's silence, the Carvers recognized the truth. She had made her move. Here the atmosphere grows unbearable. The journals falter into broken lines, margins filled with scratches rather than words. Fear had become certainty, and certainty gave way to paralysis. The Harmons were gone, the Pritchards vanished. The Carvers alone remained to testify. All else was devoured by the trail. In their final testimony, Sarah Carver speaks of hearing Mercy whisper through the storm, "When the cave comes, do not follow him. Do not take the road he gives. There is another path. Look for my mark in the stones." What became of her afterward is obscured, but the marks she left, the birch bark codes, the carved stones near sinkholes, the ledger glimpsed but lost, form the skeleton of the horror. Through them, the veil lifts just enough to show the design, the wilderness as cover for predation, the guide as surgeon, the journey westward as a procession into his tally book of death. Thus Part 3 closes. The ledger of names remains unfound, yet its shadow stretches across every page of testimony. Mercy, frail and doomed, had shifted from victim to saboteur, marking the trail with signs the living might yet decipher. Elias Daniels, wounded but unbroken, tightened his hold, and the wilderness itself seemed to conspire, echoing the count of graves in the howl of wind through limestone cave. In the close of that year, as the leaves rotted down to their veins, and the rivers shrank into stone beds, the travelers found themselves herded, not guided toward a cavern mouth in the limestone hills. The records name it only as the Divide, but those who survived spoke of a black aperture in the cliff, tall enough to admit a wagon, and cold air streaming from its throat as though from some buried lung. It was here that Elias Daniels declared the road must part. One line of families was urged westward. Another, he claimed, would follow a southern track. But the terrain contradicted him. The maps Mercy had glimpsed in the back of his satchel showed no such fork. The division was his own invention, a means of thinning the herd. Sarah Carver's deposition, 1803, describes the scene with dreadful clarity. He stood at the cave mouth, lantern raised, and spoke of a passage that would save us days' travel. Yet the light upon his face showed no triumph, only an impatience, as though we delayed him from some greater business. My husband asked why no wagon ruts marked the way. Daniels smiled and said, "Because none before you have had the privilege." At that my blood turned. Several families balked. The Pritchards had already vanished into the underbrush. The Harmons had been swallowed months before. Now the remaining Carvers argued in hushed tones. To enter the cavern was to consign themselves to the unknown, yet to refuse was to break from the only man who knew these lands. Mercy, still wan from her pregnancy, spoke in ragged breath. Not that way. I left my mark. Stone upon stone down river. If you take his road you will not return. Later examination of the cavern yielded corroboration. In 1847, miners working the ridge uncovered a sealed shaft within the same cave system. Inside lay rusted chains fixed to bedrock, and the remains of wooden crates filled with lime. Among the fragments were human bones too jumbled to identify. The miners closed the chamber and swore silence. Only one sketch survives in the archives of the Historical Society, stamped withheld from public circulation. The artifacts of Daniel's trade surfaced here too. Parish logs describe how, upon search of his abandoned satchel, were found 3 curious instruments: a pair of obstetrical forceps, bent at one hinge, a set of calipers with notches inked in red, as though recording skull measures, a leather strap stiff with what appeared to be dried blood. Scholars at Williamsburg College in the 1870s suggested these were remnants of early phrenological experiments, a pseudoscience that sought to read heredity from cranial shape. But in the testimony of Sarah Carver, these tools were not used for measurement alone. I saw him touch the iron upon the boy Harmon's head, pressing as one tests a melon. When the child winced, he made a note. Then he turned to his book and crossed a circle. It was done without malice, but with the calm of a clerk. The detail aligns with descriptions of the lost ledger columns of lives reduced to symbols. The night before the families were to enter the cavern, Mercy is said to have wandered among them, placing pebbles in children's hands, whispering to them to remember her marks in the stone. She no longer wept, nor pleaded. Instead, she bore the composure of one resigned, even consecrate. Sarah Carver remembered her saying, "He counts us as cattle, but cattle may yet trample the butcher." It is at this juncture that the depositions break into contradiction. Some claimed the Carvers attempted open defiance, seizing their wagon and forcing the march eastward. Others believed they feigned obedience, entering the cave only by lantern light, before slipping away at a hidden fissure Mercy had marked. What is beyond dispute is that not all who entered the cavern emerged again. Parish burial lists of 1800 record 6 lost to stone and water. No graves marked their names. No bodies were recovered. Only the echo of their absence remains. The most chilling relic, preserved still in the county archive, is a page torn from Daniel's correspondence, discovered in the possession of a trader years later. It reads, "The families divide as expected. Resistance wanes when hunger is sharp. The Carvers hesitate, but they will follow. The cave is sufficient. The specimens once separated may be treated with discretion. I require no witnesses, only continue." The letter bears a watermark from the Richmond Anatomical Society, though the society itself has no record of Daniel's membership. Scholars differ as to whether this was forgery or evidence of a darker fraternity that sanctioned his act. Sarah Carver's final account concludes with the moment of decision. "We heard the water within the cave, like some vast mill grinding. He bade us follow and raised his lantern high. Mercy clutched her belly and would not move. She whispered to me, 'I will draw. Take the others where the stones lean,' and then her voice dropped to nothing. The wind took her words. When next I looked, she was already stepping into the dark at his side." Thus ends her testimony. What became of Mercy thereafter is uncertain. Some claim she perished within, her body never found. Others believe she survived long enough to wound Daniels a second time, for in later records he is described as limping, his stride shortened as though one leg had been shattered. The Carvers alone re-emerged into daylight, reduced in number and shaken into silence. They carried no belongings, no ledgers, no instruments, only scars, and the memory of Mercy's sacrifice. Their testimony, recorded years later, forms the backbone of what we know. But in the cave still lie the echoes, chains, lime, bone, and the tally of names that never reached their western horizon. By the turn of spring, what remained of the company straggled into the settlements with eyes hollow as burned-out lanterns. Their tongues were heavy, yet when pressed they began to speak, not in full testimony, but in fragments, as though each feared the other might betray a memory too foul to endure. From these murmurs grew the portrait of Elias Daniel's true obsession, not the journey west, but the body itself, and the secrets carried in its flesh. The Carver manuscript, sealed 1811, gives the earliest detail. There in Sarah's wavering hand we read, "He spoke not of souls but of stock, not of salvation but of succession." His words were the words of a breeder, not a shepherd. He believed lineaments ran as water through generations, that a jaw, a brow,
a weakness of lung might be transmitted entire, and that by isolation he might learn the law. To Daniel's childbirth was not a sacrament but a specimen yielded to his ledger. Where a mother saw her child's first breath, he saw only the chance to measure skull and bone, to weigh the ratio of limb, to judge the persistence of traits he deemed degenerate. Fragments from his abandoned papers folios, smuggled into the Williamsburg collections in 1832, show tables headed progeny defects and potentials. The columns bear cryptic marks, crescents for deformity, circles for stillbirth, crosses for vigor retained. These notations align eerily with parish registers. Each crescent correlates to a burial entry, each circle to a child never christened. One marginal sketch depicts a pair of forceps modified with screws, as though to apply more pressure than simple delivery required. Below, a note in Daniel's hand, necessary for study. Fragile crowns may yet yield knowledge. Mercy's warnings take on sharper light here. Before her disappearance in the cavern, she had whispered to Sarah that he gathers not the living but the unborn. It was no metaphor. Daniels believed that heredity might be captured, distilled and preserved through meticulous dissection of infants who never lived past birth. The most disturbing testimony comes from Reverend Atwood's trial deposition, in which he recounted the confessions of a wagoner who had fled Daniel's camp. He said the doctor took babes from their mothers under pretext of baptizing them quick, but rather he set them on a board, calipers in hand. Those born frail he pressed till their cries ceased. He wrote a symbol in his book and gave the body back swaddled, saying, "Not but God wills." The women, undone with grief, scarce knew what was done. Whether this account is literal truth or terror magnified by rumor is uncertain. Yet the coincidence of registers and Daniel's symbols admits no easy dismissal. By 1801, Daniel's name had begun to stir unease among other guides and traders. Reports filtered back east of a physician who lingered behind, marking graves more often than milestones. Some families were said to have vanished altogether under his care, leaving no trace but notches in trees and scattered belongings. Still, many dismissed such accounts. Frontier travel was perilous. Cholera, famine, fever and raids claimed countless lives. To attribute every misfortune to one man seemed at the time superstition. Only later did patterns emerge too stark to ignore. The medical fraternity itself bears a shadow here. In the Transactions of the American Philosophical Society, Eats, 1802, an unsigned paper appears entitled Observations on Congenital Dispositions in Isolated Communities. Though anonymous, its language mirrors Daniel's phrasing, particularly the assertion that degeneration may be traced through cranial measure, and that intervention in earliest infancy is most instructive. Marginalia in the Carver manuscript suggests Sarah herself read this paper years later and recognized its hand. Beside one passage she scrawled, "It is he, I know the cadence." They print his heresy as if it were true. The surviving instruments catalogued in 1847, forceps, calipers, straps, were displayed briefly in the county courthouse before being locked away. One observer, a physician named Halstead, described them thus: "The calipers are not those of Hippocrates, but altered to bite rather than measure. The forceps are crude, their joints stiffened to crush as well as draw. These are no tools of deliverance but of experiment, an anatomy upon the living." That such implements were carried on a wagon journey, concealed among grain sacks and linen, is perhaps the most telling indictment. Daniels prepared not for safe passage but for continued harvest of his dreadful studies. The psychological toll upon the survivors is equally recorded. Sarah Carver, in her later years, wrote of night terrors in which she heard Mercy's voice from the cavern, urging her to mind the marks. Children who lived spoke of dreams in which a tall figure pressed cold iron upon their brow. Parish records note several youths of the Carver line afflicted with fits, night wanderings and aversions to lantern light. Historians debate whether these were hereditary seizures, or the residue of trauma. Yet within the Gothic confines of this tale, both explanations entwine trauma encoded in blood, carried forward as if by curse. One chilling aside survives in the margins of Daniel's torn letter, where defects persist. Observe the daughters. Transmission is surer than. Some scholars interpret this as early recognition of maternal inheritance. Others see only the derangement of a man who treated women as vessels for his experiment. Whichever reading, it reveals his fixation. Heredity as destiny, women as archives of defect and prom. Thus Part 5 closes upon a revelation. Daniel's project was never merely opportunistic cruelty. It was systematic, pseudo-scientific, and inscribed in the very marrow of those he led. To him, each cry, each measure, Each grave was but an entry in the ledger of heredity, and yet his network had not ended in that cavern. Other names begin to surface. Merchants and physicians who shared his correspondences, and whose own wagons bore instruments too carefully concealed. If the horrors of Elias Daniels had ended with his death in the cavern, history might have closed over him like earth upon a grave, yet the record resists barrier. What scattered survivors murmured in fear, and what archivists later unearthed in sealed packets, reveals something darker. Daniels was no lone aberration, but a node in a hidden correspondence, his hand joined by others who shared his obsession.
The Carver manuscript hints at this connection. Beneath one smudged page, Sarah scribbled, "He read letters at night, wax cracked in haste. They bore no name, only the seal of a merchant's guild. He smiled when he broke them, as if assured his work was witnessed afar." For decades this note meant little. But in 1842, when a trunk of documents surfaced in Richmond, scholars compared seals and signatures. There, amidst mundane bills of lading, appeared a set of folded folios inscribed, "On generations," dated 1799, countersigned by 3 hands. Daniels, a trader named Hiram Yates, and a physician from Philadelphia, Dr. Martin Kell. The implication is chilling: a triad of men, a guide, a merchant, and a physician, each contributing to a project that cloaked itself in commerce, scholarship, and necessity. From Yates came the means. Wagons provisioned under his accounts bore double compartments, the lower filled not with grain but with crates lined in waxed cloth, suitable for preserving specimens. Customs records confirm such wagons passed unsearched, for Yates enjoyed the patronage of colonial officials. From Kell came the rhetoric. Papers filed with the Philadelphia College of Physicians contain striking parallels to Daniels' notes. In Proceedings, 1800, a tract entitled, "On Hereditary Dispositions of the Rural Poor," describes the necessity of separating stock for close observation, lest tainted blood be perpetuated. Though printed under Kell's name, annotations in Daniels' distinctive script margin notes, exclamation points, corrections, reveal collaboration. Daniels himself supplied the frontier, a crucible where secrecy was natural, where families vanished unrecorded in the wilderness, and where his peculiar instruments drew less notice than they would have in polished halls. Together they formed a circle, commerce furnishing concealment, medicine supplying theory, and Daniels providing practice. The trial of Reverend Atwood, already tainted by his failure to denounce Daniels, offered glimpses of this network. One witness recalled Atwood speaking of benefactors who demanded silence, for they had interest in what the doctor discovered. These benefactors, unnamed, are thought by some to be Yates and Kell. The court, eager to close the scandal, declined to pursue such speculation, but letters hidden in the archives of St. Paul's Parish, later catalogued by accident, reopen the matter. One addressed simply to "Our fellow in Virginia," urges, "Continue your accounts, even of those infants which fail to draw breath. Their likenesses are to be rendered by caliper and forceps alike. Such reckonings are our scripture, by which future men may judge the laws of generation." The chilling phrase, "reckonings are our scripture," has since been quoted in monographs as emblematic of the perverse religiosity that clung to these men, a science recast as sacrament. What is perhaps more dreadful than the existence of accomplices is the institutional silence that followed. The Philadelphia College never censured Kell. The merchant guilds of Richmond never revoked Yates' license. Daniels was allowed to become the scapegoat, a solitary devil, while his correspondence melted back into respectability. The Carver's oral tradition preserves this bitterness. In a fireside tale recorded in 1867, Sarah's grandson retells his grandmother's warning, "Mind ye, he were not alone. The merchant filled his purse. The doctor fed his head. They let him be buried in the cavern, so their hands came out clean, but the marks are still in the book." Here the book refers to Daniel's lost folios, of which only fragments survive. The implication, whether true or imagined, is that fuller volumes circulated privately among his peers. Instruments themselves corroborate this suspicion. The catalogue of seized items in 1803 lists forceps of varying make, some English, some French, others custom forged. One bore the initials M.K. Another crate, though attributed to Daniels, was stamped with the merchant's sigil. These traces suggest that supply and design came from multiple hands, not his alone. The human consequence, however, remained concentrated on the families he guided. Surviving children bore not only scars of memory but the possibility of hereditary stigma, illnesses, fits, and frailties noted in parish logs for decades thereafter. Physicians who examined them often remarked with clinical detachment, never acknowledging that such fragility might be the legacy of manipulation rather than fate. The psychological horror deepens when we consider Mercy's sacrifice anew. Her warnings were not directed solely at Daniel. By luring him into the cavern and sealing his body there, she severed one limb of a greater organism, yet the letters suggest she intuited the breadth of his network. Some accounts claim she whispered to Sarah, "Cut one root, but beware the tree," and the tree endured. Kell continued to publish anonymously or under initials treatises on heredity, later cited in European journals. Yates' trade routes expanded, and with them the silent transport of goods, whose true contents may never be known. In retrospect, Daniel's exposure may have been a calculated sacrifice, allowing his partners to proceed without scrutiny. The cavern thus becomes not only a tomb but a diversion, history's gaze fixed on one monstrous figure, while others carried on in dimmer light. The archivist's dilemma arises here. For every scrap that survives, marginalia, parish register, seized instrument, there are gaps, lacunae where fire, water, or deliberate excision has consumed the rest. Redactions stamped property of the society appear across folios, suggesting suppression rather than accident. We are left with echoes of a network that might never be fully mapped but which radiates outward from the Daniels episode, like rings in a pond. If Daniel's instruments were buried with him in the cavern, his designs were not. They endured in the flesh of those he altered, and in the papers passed among his confederates. By the 1820s, when the first children of the afflicted families began to bear offspring of their own, physicians whispered of patterns too uncanny to dismiss. Parish records and medical notes. The Register of St. Paul's Parish, 1821, contains a troubling marginal notation beside the birth of a child to the Carver line. Male infant, weak in constitution, head grossly enlarged, the fontanelle not closed. The note is signed by Dr. Medmer White, who added in smaller script, "Third such case, observed in this family within 1 decade, no known cure." Such annotations recur through the registers of both the Carver and Atwood lines. Children stillborn, others surviving with frailties that stunted growth, eyes clouded, limbs twisted. Midwives who attended these births spoke of marks upon the skull as if some hand had pressed there before the hour of labor. The inherited instrument. What horrifies most in retrospect is that the defects carried resemblance to Daniel's instruments themselves. The widened craniums matched the span of his brass calipers. The torsions of limbs suggested the forceps with serrated jaws. Physicians like White, who had never seen Daniel's workshop, described deformities uncannily consistent with the tools seized decades before. Thus a grotesque theory took hold, that Daniel's meddling had not ended with the individual child, but had etched itself into heredity, a kind of mechanical signature passed from womb to womb. The suppressed paper of Dr. Kell. Evidence of this theory appears in a redacted tract once attributed to Dr. Kell of Philadelphia, titled On Transmission of Acquired Malformations, Journal of the American Medical Repository, 1808, withdrawn. It argued that traumas introduced at conception or birth may, under certain providences, repeat themselves in progeny, as though engraved upon the germ itself. Kell's words, stripped from the official journals, survive only in copies smuggled into private collections. His clinical tone belies the horror. If a limb be bent or the skull compressed at earliest moments, there is likelihood the next generation shall mirror such form, without external provocation. Thus an art once performed perpetuates itself as nature. Scholars suspect this was no speculation, but direct reference to Daniel's practices, his data funneled into Kell's theory. Psychological consequence. Among the afflicted families, dread spread faster than illness. Mothers dreaded conception. Fathers, half mad with guilt, whispered that they had permitted a curse to enter their line. In Sarah Carver's later diary, kept until her death in 1834, one passage reads, "I see him yet in the brow of my grandson, not in memory alone, but in the very flesh. God forgive me, for I let mercy go into the earth to silence him, yet still he comes forth in us." The sense that Daniels remained alive, embedded in blood rather than body, drove many to madness. 2 Atwood men drowned themselves in the Rappahannock within the same year, leaving notes that named no earthly creditor but the doctor. The circulation of specimens. Meanwhile, fragments of the bodies themselves circulated in medical cabinets. In 1839,
A customs ledger lists a crate shipped from Richmond to London, declared as curiosities of natural formation. The crate contained 3 glass jars, each holding a malformed fetal specimen, preserved in spirit. One jar bears a surviving museum tag, though the specimen is long lost. Infant skull, Virginia, c. 1800. Cranial diameter 7.5 inches. Fontanelle unfused. Source marked D. That letter, mute yet damning, ties the specimen directly to Daniel's circle. Though most museums deny housing such remains today, antiquarian dealers whisper of private cabinets where they persist. Generational stigma. The consequences extended beyond physiology. Parish logbooks show the carver and Atwood descendants increasingly intermarried among themselves, other families reluctant to risk their name with tainted stock. Isolation compounded degeneration, epilepsy, melancholia, and stillbirth multiple. A doctor visiting the region in 1852 wrote in his notebook, "They appear to me like a people apart, as though some doom had been written upon them. The eyes of the children are wide, unblinking, and I observed in one youth a strange protuberance of the brow which he hid beneath his cap." The persistence of silence. What remains most chilling is that none of these accounts provoked intervention. Clergy preached resignation. Physicians filled their ledgers but not their consciences. The afflicted were left to bear the double weight of bodily frailty and communal suspicion. And over all hovered the rumor, never proven, that Kell himself continued to collect reports, dispatching agents to record births, deaths, and deformities, as though curating a ledger of the hereditary experiment begun by Daniel. The archivist's reflection. In reviewing these records, one senses a kind of living laboratory stretched across generations, with no walls but bloodline, no instruments but the shadow of those once wielded by Daniel. It is as if the cavern sealed in 1802 was not a tomb but a womb, birthing affliction that could not be interred. The inheritance was not merely genetic but psychic. Families passed down both the traits and the terror, until child and parent alike believed themselves condemned. Thus does horror achieve its most enduring form, not in the act itself, but in the echo carried across time. The cover-up. The cavern was closed in 1802, yet the silence that followed was not the silence of resolution, but of suppression. By the 1840s, whispers of Daniel's instruments and Kell's theories had begun to seep into scholarly circles. The question was not whether others knew, but how much they chose to conceal. The Governor's Commission. In 1843, the Governor of Virginia appointed a discreet commission to review irregular medical practices, formerly alleged in the counties of Rockbridge and Albemarle. The report, never printed, survives in a single manuscript copy housed at the Virginia Historical Society, its margins stamped private, not for circulation. Within, the commissioners record testimonies from aging parish clerks, midwives, and militiamen who remembered the seizure of Daniel's notes. One clerk confesses, "I held in my hands a volume bound in calf, upon whose leaves were drawn instruments most cruel and unfit for Christian use. These were not delivered to Richmond, but destroyed at the insistence of gentlemen unnamed. Who those gentlemen were is not stated, though later annotations, perhaps by a cautious archivist, insert only the initials." The vanishing of Mercy's record. Even more disturbing was the deliberate effacement of Mercy Carver's testimony. Her deposition, taken under oath before Daniel's arrest, vanishes from the court file. In its place, a blank folio is bound, stamped with the words, "This page intentionally left void." Such language is rare in the records of the period, suggesting intentional removal. Yet in an attic chest of the Carver household, discovered in 1908, there was found a fragment of parchment bearing Mercy's hand. He kept a ledger of mothers' names, their dates of confinement, and beside each a mark of steel, as if to number the wounds he had claimed. The ledger itself has never surfaced. If it was seized by the commission, it was burned, or buried deeper. Academic complicity. Meanwhile, in medical journals, faint traces of Daniel's influence emerge. The 1847 Transactions of the American Philosophical Society contains an essay by Dr. Rasmus Flint, ostensibly on cranial development, in which he footnotes the observations of an early Virginian practitioner, initials D.K., whose methods were regrettable but whose measurements retain interest. The Society's archivist, reviewing the same issue in 1862, struck through Flint's citation in red ink, and scrawled, "Expunge dangerous." Yet by then the ideas had already traveled, repeated in lectures at Edinburgh, and even whispered in obstetrical circles of Paris. Thus Daniel's tools, though hidden, lived on as diagrams in foreign notebooks. The shrinking circle of witnesses. By the mid-century, those who had stood against Daniels were nearly all gone. Sarah Carver's death in 1834 silenced one of the last direct witnesses. The Atwoods dwindled in number, and the Harmons moved westward, leaving only haunted stories in their wake. It was then, in 1851, that a traveling minister named Reverend Hiram Blake reported being summoned to a deathbed in Staunton. The dying man, who refused to give his surname, pressed into the minister's hand a sealed envelope marked "Deliver to no one save an honest physician." Blake kept it hidden for 20 years before curiosity overcame him. Inside lay a single drawing, a long-handled forceps, with screw-tightened jaws, more device than instrument, bearing initials DK, etched at the joint.
This drawing, now catalogued at the Library of Congress, is the only surviving schematic verifiably tied to Daniel's hand. The question remains, why did so many choose to conceal rather than condemn? The merchant's role. One answer lies in commerce. Ledgers from Norfolk merchants reveal shipments of surgical brass and tempered steel, invoiced under the vague term scientific instruments dating from the very years of Daniel's practice. These invoices bear signatures of reputable trading houses, whose heirs later served as benefactors to colleges and hospitals. Exposure of Daniel's network would have implicated not merely one deranged doctor, but an entire mercantile web. Better, it seems, to smother the story beneath euphemism and erasure. A cave not fully sealed, even the cavern itself was not safe from tampering. In 1869, quarrymen blasting limestone near Rockbridge stumbled upon a fissure that opened into a black corridor lined with bones. Local papers suppressed the discovery, publishing only that an ancient burial site was disturbed. But a letter from one quarryman to his wife, preserved in family hands, states plainly, "There were shelves cut into the rock with jars still upon them. The foreman bid us break the glass and bury the contents, lest word spread. The jars, if truly remnants of Daniel's collection, are gone." But the letter aligns with oral lore that Mercy's cave was not sealed in mercy at all, but re-entered when profit or curiosity demanded. The archivist's observation. Here the story sharpens from private horror to public crime. Daniels may have wielded the tools, but it was merchants who furnished him, scholars who cited him, officials who erased him. A whole scaffolding of complicity ensured that what should have been exposed became instead a whispered current beneath the respectable surface of American science. It is in these omissions, the blank pages and excised depositions, that the true shape of the cover-up emerges. What was done to the Carvers and their kin was not forgotten by accident. It was buried with purpose. The reckoning, the suppression could not hold forever. Time, like water in limestone, wears through even the heaviest stone. By the late 19th century, the fragments of Daniel's legacy, scraps of parchment, a broken instrument, whispers in family journals began to converge. What had been buried in scattered attics and censored archives returned, jagged and undeniable. The Carver Testament. In 1872, a young woman named Mercy Carver II, granddaughter to the original, came into possession of her grandmother's chest. Inside she discovered the faded scrap already described, Mercy's hand denouncing Daniel's legend. But beneath it lay another, longer folio stitched in coarse thread. Its opening line, trembling yet firm, declared, "I write this so none may say I was silent." The testament records in painful detail the day Daniels pressed his hands upon her, the rooms where other women were brought, and the marks cut into bone and womb alike. There are lists of names: Atwood, Harmon, Kell, each followed by symbols too cryptic to interpret. Was it a cipher for outcomes? Stillbirth, experiment, survival? We cannot know, for the ink has run in places, and some portions are smudged as if by tears. This folio, read aloud in 1873 at a gathering of dissenting Quakers in Lynchburg, ignited a fresh fire. What had been rumor became record, and the church minutes record the hushed phrase, "A witness long concealed has spoken." The scholar's rediscovery. In that same year, a young medical historian named Alaric Munson presented a lecture before the Richmond Society of Physicians, titled "On the Early Misapplications of Obstetrical Force." Though couched in scholarly diction, His paper made plain reference to a Virginian of initials. Munson quoted from notes he claimed to have transcribed while visiting the home of an aging merchant in Norfolk. Sketches of instruments, calipers that pinched the cranium, saws modified for pelvis, each bearing peculiar engraving. He suggested cautiously that these tools were not imported from Europe, but made to order in the colonies. The society reacted with fury. Munson was censured, his pamphlet withdrawn from circulation, his career nearly ruined, but copies survived in private hands. Through them, Daniel's shadow lengthened once more. The cave reopened. It was in 1884 that the land itself betrayed the cover-up. Flooding rains opened a sinkhole near the ridge above Mercy's cave, exposing chambers thought sealed since the turn of the century. Local boys who ventured inside emerged pale and retching, reporting shelves carved into the rock and glass eyes, staring from jars. Sheriff's men entered soon after, sealing the entrance with heavy stone. But one deputy, unable to keep silent, told his brother-in-law. The walls were scored with numbers, tallies by the dozen, and on the floor bones small as lambs, arranged in circles. Though dismissed as hysteria, his testimony survives in a letter preserved by his descendant. If true, it confirms that Daniel's lair had not been emptied at his arrest, that remnants of his trade lingered for generations underground. Descendants and denial. The Carvers and Harmons, by then scattered across Virginia and Kentucky, were torn between pride and shame. Some families clung to silence, fearing stigma. Others, like Mercy II, insisted the truth be preserved. Family Bibles show marginal notes: remember what was done, or never trust the midwife alone. Yet there were also denied. In 1890, a Kell descendant published a family history, in which Daniels was recast as a physician maligned by rustic superstition. The book sold poorly, but the attempt to sanitize his name reveals how fiercely some lineages clung to the illusion of respectability. The circle tightens. As the century closed, investigators and folklorists alike began to piece together the fragments. In 1897, Professor Theophilus Crane collected tales of the Doctor of the Cave among Appalachian community. His notes, unpublished but housed at Cornell, include chilling parallels to the Carver folios: infants with strange marks, mothers who vanished, clerks bribed into silence. Crane, unlike others, named his sources. Half were Carver descendants. The circle had closed. The very families once broken by Daniels became the keepers of the memory that would not die. A glimpse of justice. The reckoning never came in courtrooms, but in the persistence of story. Daniels had escaped earthly trial, his network shielded by commerce yet his name, once redacted, stamped void, re-emerged in whispers of scholars, in the cave's reopened darkness, in Mercy's own words reaching her granddaughter's hand. One late entry, in a Carver family Bible penned in 1901, reads simply, "He is not gone, for we speak his name." Thus the silence is broken. That act, naming, was the true confrontation. What governors, merchants, and societies sought to smother, the families reclaimed, stitching horror back into memory where no archivist's blade could cut it free. The archivist's note: here at last, the story assumes its sharpest edge. Suppression collapses beneath testimony, artifacts, and ancestral witness. Daniels is not defeated by law or sword, but by the stubborn refusal of his victims' descendants to forget. It is a reckoning without gallows. Yet no less final, history itself becomes the tribunal, and the verdict resounds still. The aftermath. Silence does not endure forever. What was once sealed beneath rock, folded into parish registers, or scrawled in trembling hand, has across generations clawed its way back to the surface. The story of Daniel Kell, doctor, trafficker, manipulator of womb and bloodline, survives not in court records or monuments, but in the fragile testimony of those who refused to let him vanish. The collapse of secrecy. By the turn of the 20th century, it was no longer possible to pretend nothing had happened. The Carver descendants, emboldened by Mercy's folio and the rediscovery of the cave, began speaking openly in church meetings and family reunions. Though mocked as storytellers, they insisted their ancestor had died in truth so others might live. Archivists too began to take notice. Suppressed minutes from Lynchburg congregations were uncovered, their redactions obvious and clumsy, whole pages pasted over with blank parchment, margins blotted black. In some instances the ink had bled through, revealing words beneath trial. Girls. These stains told more than the clean sheets ever could. The institutions that had once protected Daniels,
The merchant houses, the physicians' societies, the colonial courts, found themselves crumbling under modern skepticism. By 1910, Daniel's name was whispered with the same contempt reserved for witch doctors and poisoners. What had once been erased was now infamous. Mercy's legacy. In Lynchburg, a stone was set beside the churchyard in 1912. It bears no surname, only a single inscription, "To Mercy, for silence broken." Though simple, the stone became a gathering point. Women came to lay flowers. Midwives placed their scissors upon it, a ritual of remembrance. One diary records a strange moment in 1915, when an elderly Harmon matron whispered aloud at the stone, "He will not have her name again." The gesture was not about vengeance. It was about reclaiming what had been taken: dignity, voice, memory. Mercy's descendants ensured that she, not Daniel's, became the emblem passed forward, the shrinking circle. Meanwhile, the remnants of Daniel's network, those merchants, clerks, and accomplices who once facilitated his designs, faded into shadow. Their descendants, some still prosperous, carried the quiet shame of names that appeared in Mercy's testament. By the 1930s, genealogical guides in Virginia omitted references to certain lines entirely. In silence they confessed their complicity, but stories cannot be buried by omission. In Appalachian cabins, in whispered tales at hearthside, the name of the doctor of the cave persisted. Some said his tools still lay rusting in a cavern sealed by stone. Others swore they heard crying beneath the earth during storm. The historians return. It was not until the late 20th century that academic historians returned in earnest. The rediscovery of Dr. Alaric Munson's censured pamphlet sparked new inquiries. Parish records once locked in restricted collections were opened. By comparing Mercy's folios, Munson's sketches, and the folklore collected by Theophilus Crane, researchers reconstructed the lattice of secrecy. Their conclusion was grim. Daniel's had not been a lone aberration. He had flourished because an entire community of silence permitted it. Families afraid of scandal, institutions desperate to maintain authority, physicians willing to experiment on those deemed expendable. Thus the horror was never merely Daniel's himself, but the soil in which he grew. A warning forward. Even now traces endure. In museum basements there lie instruments of uncertain provenance, bone forceps with initials filed away, jars of preserved tissue mislabeled as animal specimens. Archivists whisper, uneasy, about ledgers that vanish between inventory. Each gap feels deliberate, and so the story resists closure. Mercy's sacrifice, the carver's endurance, the Harmon's scars, all testify, but they do not banish the shadow. For wherever medicine and power combine without witness, the danger returns. One modern annotation in the Carver Bible, written as late as 1979, reads, "The silence must not return. Remember Mercy, remember the cave." The outro. And so we arrive at the end, or rather the place where the end folds back into the present. Daniel's is long dead, his body gone to dust, yet the instruments he wielded, the silence that shielded him, and the memory of those he harmed remain. If you have listened thus far, remember, history does not disappear when officials decree it. It lingers in caves, in Bibles, in the voices of descendants who will not forget. Perhaps you will walk in Virginia one day, and find yourself near a ridge where water runs thin, and the earth sinks in hollows. If you hear a faint cry from below, childlike yet not human, turn away, for some doors once opened cannot be shut again.